During World War II, the Soviet Union took control of and incorporated several countries, which had effectively been handed over to them as part of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 with Nazi Germany. These countries included the eastern regions of Poland, which were integrated into 3 different Soviet Socialist republics, SSRs, as well as Latvia, which became the Latvian SSR. Estonia, the Estonian SSR, Lithuania, the Lithuanian SSR, part of eastern Finland forming the Karelo-Finnish SSR, and eastern Romania, which became the Moldavian SSR and part of the Ukrainian SSR. In addition to these territorial changes resulting from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the post-war division of Germany, the USSR also occupied and annexed Carpathian Ruthenia from Czechoslovakia in 1945, which became part of the Ukrainian SSR. The following is a list of various instances of military occupations by the Soviet Union, stemming from both their pact with Nazi Germany before World War II and the subsequent Cold War era following the Allied victory over Germany. Poland was the first country to be occupied by the Soviet Union during World War II, as the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was a secret Soviet-Nazi alliance that outlined the division of Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. By 1939, the total area of Polish territories occupied by the Soviet Union, including the area ceded to Lithuania and annexed during the formation of the Lithuanian SSR, amounted to 201,015 square kilometers, with a population of 13.299 million, including 5.274 million ethnic Poles and 1.109 million Jews. Following the conclusion of World War II, the Soviet Union retained control over most of the territories it had occupied in 1939. However, territories covering an area of 21,275 square kilometers with 1.5 million inhabitants were returned to communist-controlled Poland, notably including areas near Białystok and Przemysl. Between 1944 and 1947, over 1 million Poles were resettled from the annexed territories to Poland, mainly into the regained territories. Soviet troops, specifically the Northern Group of Forces, were stationed in Poland from 1945 until 1993. It was only in 1956 that official agreements between the communist regime in Poland established by the Soviets and the Soviet Union recognized the presence of these troops. Therefore, some Polish scholars accept the term occupation to describe the period from 1945 to 1956. The Polish government in exile continued to exist until 1990. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have been independent nations since 1918. However, in June 1940, all 3 countries were occupied by the Red Army and formally annexed into the USSR in August 1940. This occurred with the tacit approval of Nazi Germany through the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and its secret additional protocol from August 1939. The Soviet Union pressured these countries to accept its military bases in September 1939. In the event of refusal, the USSR initiated an air and naval blockade and threatened an immediate invasion with a massive troop buildup on the border. In June 1940, Soviet military forces took over the political systems of these countries and established puppet regimes through rigged elections in July 1940. The process of Sovietization was disrupted by the German occupation from 1941 to 1944. However, the Soviet Union regained control during the Baltic Offensive in 1944 to 1945 and resumed its Sovietization efforts, which were largely completed by 1950. Forced collectivization of agriculture began in 1947 and was finalized after a mass deportation in March 1949. Private farms were confiscated, and farmers were compelled to join collective farms. An armed resistance movement known as the Forest Brothers operated until the mid-1950s, with hundreds of thousands participating or supporting the movement and tens of thousands killed. Soviet authorities fighting the Forest Brothers also suffered hundreds of casualties, and innocent civilians were killed on both sides. Additionally, several underground nationalist schoolchildren groups were active, with most of their members receiving lengthy prison sentences. Punitive actions decreased significantly after Joseph Stalin died in 1953, and from 1956 to 1958, a substantial portion of deportees and political prisoners were allowed to return. Throughout the occupation, Soviet authorities engaged in various crimes, including killings, political arrests, unlawful conscriptions, and deportations of hundreds of thousands of people. Numerous other crimes against humanity were committed during this period. To impose communist ideals, authorities deliberately dismantled existing social and economic structures, imposing new ideologically pure hierarchies that severely hindered the Baltic economies. Estonian scientists have estimated economic damages directly attributable to the post-World War II occupation to be in the hundreds of billions of US dollars, which represented a substantial portion of Estonia's 2006 GDP of $21.28 billion. Despite the annexation by the Soviet Union in 1940, it is accurate to describe the Baltic states as being under occupation, particularly due to the lack of Soviet legal title. This prolonged occupation had characteristics of classical occupation, such as external control by an internationally unsanctioned force and a conflict of interest between the foreign power and the local inhabitants. However, it differed from classical occupation in significant ways. The incorporation of the Baltic states into the USSR as Soviet republics and the lengthy duration of Soviet rule challenged the applicability of traditional occupation rules from a practical standpoint. Even though annexation occurred, the presence of the USSR in the Baltic states remained an occupation sui generis. While the Soviet Union condemned the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it is currently the policy of the USSR's legal successor, the Russian Federation, to deny that these events constituted an occupation or were illegal under applicable international laws. Finnish territories in 1940 have been omitted in this summary for brevity. After the Baltic states acquiesced to Soviet demands in September and October of 1939, the Soviet Union shifted its focus toward Finland. Their demands included territorial claims on the Karelian Isthmus, the Gulf of Finland Islands, a military base near the Finnish capital, and the dismantling of defensive fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus. Finland, however, rejected these demands. In response, on November 30, 1939, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Finland, initiating the Winter War to annex Finland. During this period, the Soviets established the Finnish Democratic Republic, a short-lived puppet regime in the town of Terijoki. Additionally, the Soviets occupied the Petsamo municipality along the Barents Sea coast. The Winter War concluded on March 13, 1940, with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland maintained its independence but ceded portions of Karelia, Salla, the Rybaki Peninsula in the Barents Sea, and 4 Gulf of Finland islands. These territorial concessions amounted to 9% of Finland's land, including the important city of Viipuri, and a significant portion of its industrial capacity. Approximately 422,000 Karelians, or 12% of Finland's population, chose to evacuate rather than become Soviet subjects, resulting in the loss of their homes. Military forces and remaining civilians were hastily evacuated. When hostilities resumed in 1941, Finnish forces recaptured the lost territories and continued to advance, reaching the Svir River and Lake Wunga by year's end. In the Soviet offensive of 1944 against Finland, the Red Army's progress was halted by Finnish forces before reaching the 1940 border. In the one instance where they did cross the border, they were swiftly repelled by Finnish counterattacks. In subsequent negotiations following the halt of the Soviet offensive, Finland further ceded the Petsamo municipality to the Soviet Union in the Moscow Armistice. This territory had been taken by the Soviets from the Germans during the Petsamo-Kirkenes offensive. In June 1940, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum demanding the evacuation of the Romanian military and administration from the contested territory of Bessarabia and the northern part of Bukovina. Under pressure from Moscow and Berlin, Romania complied, leading Adolf Hitler to use the Soviet occupation of Bessarabia as a pretext for the German occupation of Yugoslavia and Greece, as well as launching Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, marking the beginning of the Eastern Front. Germany and its allies, including Finland, invaded the Soviet Union. During the conflict between the Soviet Union and the Axis powers, which ultimately resulted in the total military defeat of the latter, the USSR fully or partially occupied territories in Germany. Its satellites, some states occupied by Germany, and Austria. Some of these occupied territories became Soviet satellite states, including Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. East Germany was later established based on the Soviet zone of occupation. On August 25, 1941, British and Commonwealth forces, along with the Soviet Union, jointly invaded Iran as part of Operation Countenance. The objective was to secure Iranian oil fields and establish supply lines for the Soviets fighting against the European Axis countries on the Eastern Front. While the Soviets established the Azerbaijan People's Government in Iranian Azerbaijan and occupied the northern part of Iran, they withdrew from the rest of the country. In July 1941, Hungary, a member of the Tripartite Pact, joined Operation Barbarossa in alliance with Nazi Germany. Hungarian forces fought alongside the Wehrmacht and advanced deep into Soviet territory, reaching Stalingrad. However, by late 1942, the Soviet Red Army began pushing back the Wehrmacht and encroached on Hungarian territory in 1943-44. In September 1944, Soviet forces crossed into Hungary and launched the Budapest Offensive. As Hungary's army disregarded the armistice with the USSR, the Soviets engaged in further westward fighting against Hungarian and German forces, ultimately capturing the capital on February 13, 1945. Operations continued until early April 1945, when the last German forces and their remaining loyal Hungarian troops were defeated. The Soviets ensured the installation of a post-war government in Hungary dominated by communists before transferring authority from the occupying forces to Hungarian authorities. The presence of Soviet troops in Hungary was governed by the 1949 Mutual Assistance Treaty between the Soviet Union and Hungary. In 1956, the Hungarian Revolution erupted as a spontaneous nationwide revolt against the communist government and Soviet-imposed policies. Initially, the Soviets announced their willingness to negotiate the withdrawal of Soviet forces but later reversed this decision. On November 4, 1956, a substantial military force from the Warsaw Pact, led by Moscow, entered Budapest to suppress the armed resistance, resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the last Soviet soldier left Hungary in 1991, marking the end of the Soviet military presence in the country. The Soviet Union's second Jassy-Kishinev offensive led to the defeat of Romania, a subsequent royal coup d'état, and Romania's shift from the Axis to the Allies. Soviet troops were stationed in Romania from 1944 to 1958. On September 12, 1944, with the Red Army already controlling a significant portion of Romania's territory, an armistice agreement was signed between Romania and the USSR. Under this agreement, Romania retroceded the territory it had administered earlier in the war and subjected itself to an Allied Commission consisting of the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. On the ground, it was the Soviet Military Command, not the Western Allies, that effectively wielded authority. The presence and movement of Soviet troops were explicitly outlined in the agreement. The terms of the armistice agreement ceased on September 15, 1947, as the conditions of the 1947 Paris peace treaties took effect. The new treaty stipulated the withdrawal of all Allied forces from Romania, with the significant exception of the Soviet Union's right to maintain armed forces on Romanian territory for the sake of maintaining communication lines with the Soviet occupation zone in Austria. In the aftermath of this agreement, the Soviet presence in Romania gradually decreased, from a peak of 130,000 troops in 1947 to around 30,000. These troops were fully withdrawn by August 1958. Comparing the Soviet occupation of Romania to that of Bulgaria, it's important to note that Romania had fewer cultural and historical ties with Russia, and it had waged war against the Soviet Union. Consequently, the Soviet occupation had a heavier impact on the Romanian population, and the Soviet troops were less disciplined. On September 5, 1944, the Soviet Union declared war on Bulgaria and, on September 8, invaded the country without encountering resistance. Within a day, Soviet forces occupied northeastern Bulgaria, including the key port city of Varna. On September 8, 1944, Bulgaria declared war on Nazi Germany. Garrison detachments, led by Svino officers, overthrew the government on September 9, securing strategic points in Sofia and arresting ministers. A new government under the Fatherland Front was established, with Kimon Georgiev as prime minister. Soviet troops withdrew in 1947. In the autumn of 1944, when the northern and eastern parts of Carpathian Ruthenia were captured by the Red Army, the Czechoslovak government delegation, headed by Minister František Němec, arrived in Kos to establish a provisional Czechoslovak administration by treaties between the Soviet and Czechoslovak governments from the same year. However, after a few weeks, the Red Army and the NKVD began obstructing the delegation's work, and the National Committee of Transcarpatho Ukraine was established in Mukachevo under the protection of the Red Army. On November 26, this committee, led by Ivan Turyanitsia, proclaimed the desire of the Ukrainian people to separate from Czechoslovakia and join Soviet Ukraine. After 2 months of conflicts and negotiations, the Czechoslovak government delegation departed from Kos on February 1, 1945, leaving Carpathian Ukraine under Soviet control. After World War II, on June 29, 1945, a treaty was signed between Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union, officially ceding Carpatho Ukraine to the Soviet Union. Following the capture of Prague by the Red Army in May 1945, the Soviets withdrew from Czechoslovakia in December 1945, as part of an agreement for both Soviet and US troops to leave the country. In 1944 to 1946, Soviet troops occupied northern Norway and the Danish island of Bornholm, which was strategically located at the entrance to the Baltic Sea. Stalin had sought to secure bases in these areas late in the war. In March 1945, the Soviet deputy ambassador suggested the seizure of Bornholm, and on May 4, the Baltic Fleet was ordered to capture the island. Bornholm was heavily bombarded by Soviet forces in May 1945. The German commander, Gerhard von Kamps, failed to provide a written surrender as demanded by the Soviet commanders. Consequently, Soviet aircraft relentlessly bombed and destroyed over 800 civilian houses in Rona and Neksu and severely damaged approximately 3,000 more during May 7 to 8, 1945. On May 9, Soviet troops landed on the island and, after a brief fight, the German garrison surrendered. Soviet forces left Bornholm on April 5, 1946. The Soviet occupation zone of Germany encompassed the eastern portion of Germany and was occupied by the Soviet Union from 1945 onward. In 1949, it became the German Democratic Republic, known in English as East Germany. In 1955, the Soviet Union declared the GDR fully sovereign. However, Soviet troops remained in the country by the Four-Power Potsdam Agreement. As NATO troops continued to be stationed in West Berlin and West Germany, East Germany, and Berlin became focal points of Cold War tensions. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 created a separation barrier between East and West Germany, known in the Soviet Union and East Germany as the Anti-Fascist Protective Rampart. The Treaty on the Final Settlement Concerning Germany, signed in Moscow, mandated the withdrawal of all Soviet forces from Germany by the end of 1994. This paved the way for the reunification of East and West Germany, which was formally realized on October 3, 1990. One consequence of the occupation was the existence of children fathered by Soviet soldiers, resulting from romantic relationships, convenience, or rape. These children faced societal discrimination for decades. However, after the withdrawal of Soviet troops and the development of perestroika, some of these individuals, known as the Lost Red Army children, made efforts to learn more about their Russian fathers. The Soviet occupation of Austria lasted from 1945 to 1955. At the end of World War II, Austria and Vienna were divided into 4 occupation zones, following the terms of the Potsdam Conference. The Soviet Union expropriated over 450 businesses formerly owned by Germans and established the Administration for Soviet Property in Austria, USIA. These businesses employed less than 10% of Austria's workforce at their peak in 1951 and contributed to less than 5% of Austria's GDP at that time. On May 15, 1955, the Austrian State Treaty was signed, officially granting Austria independence and sovereignty. The treaty came into effect on July 27, and the last Allied troops departed from Austria on October 25. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria, known as the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation, in Soviet terminology, commenced on August 9, 1945. It marked the beginning of the largest campaign in the 1945 Soviet-Japanese War, reigniting hostilities between the Soviet Union and the Empire of Japan after more than 4 years of peace. The Soviet gains on the continent included Manchukuo, Mengjiang, Inner Mongolia, and the Northern Korean Peninsula. The swift defeat of Japan's Kwantung Army played a pivotal role in Japan's surrender and the conclusion of World War II. This victory underscored that the Soviet Union was both willing and capable of invading the Japanese home islands, following their rapid conquest of Manchuria and southern Sakhalin. In August 1945, the Soviet Army established the Soviet Civil Administration to govern the region until a domestic government could be established. Provisional committees were instituted throughout the area, placing communists in key positions. In February 1946, a provisional government called the North Korean Provisional People's Committee, led by Kim Il-sung, was formed. Soviet forces withdrew in 1948, eventually leading to the outbreak of the Korean War as part of an attempt to unify Korea under communist rule. Following Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration on August 14, 1945, and the announcement of the war's termination on August 15, 1945, the Soviet Union initiated the invasion of the Kuril Islands, which occurred between August 18 and September 3. This operation resulted in the expulsion of Japanese inhabitants 2 years later. Scholarly and historical accounts indicate that Afghanistan had been under Soviet influence since as early as 1919 when it began receiving aid to counter the British Empire's influence in the region. Major Soviet technical assistance, military aid, and economic relations escalated in the 1950s, eventually leading to the Communist Revolution in the 1970s. Faced with a threat to the Afghan Communist government, Afghanistan invited the Soviet Union to intervene, which commenced on December 24, 1979. The USSR organized an extensive military airlift into Kabul, involving approximately 280 transport aircraft and 3 divisions, totaling nearly 8,500 men each. Within 2 days, the Soviet Union had gained control of Afghanistan, initially securing Kabul by deploying a special Soviet assault unit against Jerusalem Palace. This location witnessed fierce but brief resistance from elements of the Afghan army loyal to Hafizullah Amin. Amin's death at the palace led to the installation of Babrak Karmal, the exiled leader of the Parcham faction of the PDPA, as Afghanistan's new head of government. The peak of the conflict occurred in 1985-86, during which Soviet forces launched their most significant and effective assaults on the Mujahideen supply lines near Pakistan. Major offensives had also pushed the Mujahideen into a defensive position near Herat and Kandahar. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet troops departed Afghanistan as scheduled, marking the conclusion of their involvement in the conflict.